Thank you everybody for hopping on our School Climate Transformation Grant webinar series. I'm Jessica Swain Bradway. We're going to get started in just 1 minute here. Up. Now we're getting started. It's officially 8 o'clock Pacific time, 11 o'clock Eastern time. And today we are extremely lucky. Our topic is very interesting and we've got some really great presenters today. So this is our final School Climate Transformation Grant webinar for the year. As a reminder, our other webinars are recorded and available on PBIS.org. We are talking today about systematic screening for emotional and behavioral challenges in tiered systems. And I mean it when I say we are super lucky to have our presenters on with us today. We have Kathleen Lane and Mark Weist. Mark received his PhD in clinical psychology from Virginia Tech in 1991. He completed his internship at Duke, and he is currently a professor at clinical community and school psychology in the Department of Psychology in the University of South Carolina. He was on the faculty of the University of Maryland for 19 years, where he helped to found and direct the Center for School Mental Health. This is one of the 2 national centers providing leadership to the advancement of school mental health policies and programs in the U.S. I have personally tapped into Mark's expertise to get some help around school-based mental health supports. He's really helpful there. He's also resourceful. He's edited 9 books and published and presented widely in school mental health in the areas of trauma, violence, and youth, evidence-based practices, cognitive behavioral theory, positive behavior supports, and is leading some work across the nation in the interconnected systems framework, the merging of school mental health within the PBIS framework. He is currently co-leading a regional conference on school behavioral health and leading 2 sites in randomized control trials on the interconnected system framework. Really lucky to have him here today. Our second presenter is Kathleen Lane. Kathleen is a professor in the Department of Special Ed at the University of Kansas. Her research interests focus on designing, implementing, and evaluating comprehensive, integrated, 3-tiered models of prevention to prevent the development of learning and behavioral challenges, and to respond to existing challenges, with an emphasis on systematic screenings. Anytime we have a question in Midwest PBS about screening, we go to Kathleen. She's a co-editor of Remedial and Special Education and the Journal of Positive Behavior Intervention, and she has co-authored 7 books and published over 141 refereed journal articles and 31 book chapters. Pretty amazing. So very accomplished, very nice folks. And I am now going to pass it off to Kathleen and Mark.
Thank you very much, Jessica. It's Mark. I'll take the baton here. It's a privilege to do this presentation, and we appreciate that introduction, Jessica and Ivan Polk, for all your work in helping get this set up. It's also a privilege for me to do it with Kathleen, who maybe is the leading expert in the nation in this whole topic, and so I'm grateful to be doing this work with Kathleen. This is what we'll cover. It's a very critical agenda, important work beginning, but it really is the beginning of this work in many communities. There are numerous challenges, some recommendations that are emerging. Doing it with schools joining forces with the mental health system and other youth-serving systems is really the most viable direction, so we'll spend a little bit of time discussing that. We'll then hear from Kathleen and her CI3T model and screening that's occurring within that, and we'll leave some time for comments and questions with all of you from around the country. I see there are 56 people, and thank you for allocating time for this. Kathleen and I also have some thanks here. You can see colleagues who've assisted us in this work. The big rationale here is that child and adolescent mental health challenges are among the greatest unmet healthcare needs in the United States. You can see a few studies here, and this is with thanks to my colleague Joni Splett from the University of Florida. You can see some studies here where around 1 in 5 youth are presenting pretty significant impairment, and you can see around 1 in 10 youth with more severe impairment. And we can see this also from my colleague Joni Splett, the Great Smoky Mountain study, where it documents when problems are initially identified and then when services are received through initial diagnosis entry into the mental health system. And you can see that there's a gap there. And we know that for many of the mental health challenges youth experience, that the longer that gap exists, the more entrenched the problems become. For example, anxiety is a very treatable problem in children, but if time goes by, it becomes more intractable and more difficult to treat. So we want to reduce the latency between when youth are identified with emotional behavioral problems and when they receive assistance. Back in around 2004, I was privileged to work with the American School Health Association, and we had a task force on this whole issue of mental health screening in schools, which was beginning to happen in some level of earnest back then, but we also identified a number of challenges. One very prominent challenge is most communities just don't have the resources to respond to the significant mental health needs presented by youth in the community. Given that, then one of the conclusions of our task force was we should do screening, but as we do that, we need to rally around individual schools with mental health staff from other schools and from the mental health system assisting in the work to make sure that once we identify issues, we're able to then respond to them appropriately. Kathleen will speak some around the notion of parental approval. We definitely want to have parents and guardians and family members on board with this process. Sometimes some of the questions are fairly intrusive. We don't want to create an uproar in a community where we're asking things about children and parents aren't on board with that. We need achievable and gated strategies, so simpler, briefer strategies that then when youth are identified as having more intense needs, they have a more intensive assessment, which then connects ideally to evidence-based intervention. Another conclusion of that task force was that we saw a lot of communities just avoiding this issue of screening in schools because they didn't have the capacity to actually respond to the needs that were identified. And we strongly recommended against that, that we've got to go down this road of screening, and as we do so, to gather data on the unmet mental health needs of youth, which can then spur local, state, national policy on better meeting those needs. I'm privileged to still have the connection to the Center for School Mental Health, now directed by Sharon Stephen and Nancy Lever. A very impressive work. Their center has been refunded by the Health Resources and Services Administration, and there's a very impressive national quality initiative going on now trying to document where we stand in the area of mental health in schools in the United States, but also trying to improve the quality of those programs. And screening is one of the most prioritized topics in this agenda of building capacity in the school mental health field. And you see some of the other issues that the center has identified. Obviously, as we begin to more intensively assess students' emotional behavioral functioning, then there may be issues with confidentiality and privacy, and we need to be very respectful about those things for students. We need to do the work in ways that's consistent with regulations, HIPAA, FERPA, et cetera. Pardon my use of those acronyms. Data system and infrastructure is a real big one. We've got to move beyond expensive paper and pencil measures where we collect a lot of data. It's very costly, and then there are constraints on our ability actually to do anything with those data. We've got to move to systems that are actually facile and able to implement the screening and then respond to the needs. There's this notion of there's a lot of proprietary measures out there, a lot of expense. How do we move beyond that? How do we begin to use public domain measures? How do we also use various informants, teacher, parents, students? There's the issue of we want to identify the right level of students in need versus under-identifying or over-identifying. And there are also concerns around liabilities. For example, if a school identifies a lot of need and then doesn't have the capacity to respond, then the liability has increased. We're seeing, again, thanks to the Center for their review, screening happening all around the country, lots of schools beginning to do this, many different tools. people are focusing on whether screening results actually connect to other domains of functioning, such as grades, behavioral referrals. We want to have measures that are sensitive but also specific. So in other words, identifying youth that have needs, and when a screening process identifies other students who don't have needs, that's also real, that those students who aren't identified in fact don't have needs. Most studies are doing screening at one time point, and usually often at a grade level, and we're seeing a fair amount of this happening in the latter elementary grades and in middle schools. As I mentioned, there's an increasing concern about so many measures are proprietary and expensive, difficult for schools to be able to manage this expense. We're moving more toward measures that are actually out there in the public domain, and there are many of them that are very strong. And there's an emerging work group on evidence-based assessment sponsored by the center that's really focusing on this issue of achievability and user-friendliness of measures that we use in screening. And you can see this slide where there are free assessment measures that have been organized by the center. Briefly, this notion of interconnecting school mental health and PBIS is really gaining some momentum around the country, sponsored by the two national centers. I won't go into depth here, but you can see a lot of strength in the area of mental health services in schools. By this we mean expanded mental health, the mental health system joining in with the school employees. We see strengths, but we also see some areas in need of improvement. Similarly, on the PBIS side, now in more than 22,000 schools, a lot of strength, but we have some areas in need of improvement at tiers 2 and 3, and moving beyond just looking at things through the lens of behavior. So there's a lot of work going on around the country, more than 15 states with demonstration projects focusing on this notion of interconnecting school mental health and PBIS. There's this notion of symmetry and processes, what's happening in buildings, looking similar to what's happening in districts, and a back and forth in the dialogue between district experiences, building experiences, and the state leaders being on board with that. This monograph on the PBIS.org website, if you go on the website and search school mental health, this monograph should come up. It's meant to provide user-friendly guidance on all various dimensions of implementing the ISF in schools. And we're learning that as we have more resources to do the work, that there are a continuum of screening strategies. One is to simply educate the staff on emotional behavioral challenges in students and have them then mediate referrals. And then there are other strategies moving on up to the comprehensive approach that Kathleen will present. This is from a colleague, Bob Stevens, in Charleston, where just simply looking at characteristics of students, such as attendance, age, grades, reduced or free lunch status, and behavioral issues can help determine whether a student has a level of need. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today and to learn from the great things that Mark and his team are doing. And thanks again to Jessica and to Ivan. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you a little bit about the work my colleagues and I have been working on for a number of years in this integrated model that we refer to as the CI3T model that you heard about. It's comprehensive, integrated, three-tiered models of prevention. And at the heart of it is the PBIS framework, the same recommendations by the National Center, but in an effort to meet students' academic, behavior, and social needs in an integrated fashion, what we've been doing for the last several years is working with school site teams that include an administrator with decision-making authority, 2 members from the general education community, a member from the special education community. There are other related service providers, for example, school counselors, school psychologists, instructional coaches, behavior specialists, and the like, along with a parent and a student that participate in this. And together, rather than having separate teams that are looking at different sources of information about kids, so rather than having an RTI or MTSS team that's only looking at academic data, or a PBIS team that's only looking at behavioral data, or having another a team that's looking at issues like bullying prevention and mental health, we encourage the development of one unified framework. And as part of this framework, we work with schools to pick a validated curricula to help meet students' academic, social and emotional needs at Tier 1. And as part of this, in focusing on picking a validated curriculum, we work with schools to think about their immediate goals for their community and think about what every single student needs to know at Tier 1. And this curricula is actually taught by the general education teacher so that every single student is receiving this information at Tier 1, the same logic of preventing harm from occurring. And as part of this model also, we support schools in installing systematic screenings at 3 times a year to systematically look for and support students that have needs beyond Tier 1 efforts. And as I'm going to talk about, in addition to connecting kids to needed Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, a large part of this is talking what Mark was referring to about you want to not screen if you're not prepared to use the data. So we'll talk about how to use these screening data to inform instruction at Tier 1, empower teachers with low-intensity strategies so that they can more comfortably manage students' social and behavioral needs, and then ultimately connect kids to these supports. So returning to this idea about the social and emotional component at Tier 1, one of the things that we want to look at as Tier 1 is making sure that we are leveling the playing field for all adults and all kids in the building by bringing in an evidence-based program that, if taught with fidelity, is likely to achieve the intended outcomes for students. So as part of this decision-making process, this CI3T team will look into established sources such as What Works Clearinghouse and SAMHSA sites to look to see what their intended goals are and then to see what supports are currently available that can yield that return. So for example, in one of the systems that we work with, they went through a decision-making process where they first worked with their elementary schools in building their CI3T framework, and as part of that, all of the teams attending in this district, and there were 14, they had an opportunity to get on the website, see the summary of the evidence behind each curriculum, and then they had actually narrowed the field to 3 different curricula. The district level team met with principals and went more in depth. They contacted the publisher, they looked at the outcomes, they considered issues of expense, and they elected to focus on using positive action across their elementary school. So then think about that in their community. Now every single elementary age student from kindergarten through 5th grade are hearing those same messages about taking care of a healthy body and mind, how to manage yourself, how to address issues of anxiety, etc. And at the later years, when they went through the planning process to support the middle and high school years, they went through a similar vetting process, and they decided on Connect with Kids. And that is a video-based program that is largely conversation-based. And in terms of their decisions as to how and why they arrived at these different curricula, what they did is, as I mentioned, they looked at the evidence behind the program, because we want to be really cautious in making any Tier 1 selection to make sure that, one, that there's a plan for monitoring fidelity of it, and secondly, that the plan includes a plan for responding when kids do have challenges that need more than Tier 1 effort, so that we want to be prepared to support them. So for example, when looking at the positive action curriculum, these were some of the pieces of information that they used to make their selection process. They looked to see what were the noted improvements, what it would be in terms of planned reductions in terms of absenteeism, dropping out, etc. And so they not only looked at these summary data, they actually went into warehouses like What Works Clearinghouse to look at high-quality studies and the results that followed to make sure that they were targeting the intended outcomes. They did the same pattern of inquiries that the Connect with Kids, because the intent here was to make sure that if you're going to invest in meeting kids' social and emotional considerations, we want to pick something that has a high probability of working if we make that investment. And then what they did after they made those selections is that they define in their CI3T blueprint what that's going to look like. So once these programs are purchased, it's not enough just to purchase them, but we need to support defining roles and responsibilities for what we are expecting students to participate in. So in other words, how is every student in that school, whether or not they're on an IEP, how are they going to access this information at Tier 1? And as part of it, they establish very clear expectations for faculty and staff to be able to teach that curriculum. So as part of their blueprint, they establish an instructional schedule. So for example, with positive action, they had dedicated times where instruction was going to occur across those buildings. And prior to asking teachers to teach these, and sometimes they're co-taught with counselors and sometimes not, they actually made sure that the curriculum was in the hands of the teacher. They received the professional learning in a way that was comfortable for them. So for example, some districts will make that curriculum available at the end of the year so that teachers have the full summer to attend different professional learning materials or opportunities and review the materials to make sure that they're comfortable with it. One of the local high schools that's getting ready to install their social and emotional component, they have been very intentional about making sure that teachers are prepared to lead these conversations to support kids' mental health needs and other issues that are included in these packaged curriculum. So they have preview dates to review lessons. They have counselors available to support teachers in being comfortable in negotiating some of these Tier 1 conversations. So in addition to making that transparent for faculty and staff, also as part of that, there is, and I apologize, I don't look like I'm having a slight technical difficulty there. In addition to being able to share it with faculty and staff, they also are very transparent with the parent community to make sure that that they know what is being taught, the content of the lessons, etc. So when you look at these roles and responsibilities for faculty and staff, then we also want to make sure that parents are aware of what is being taught at Tier 1. So some schools will post this information on their website, some will send home monthly topics or do some pre-corrections as far as the content to be covered. And in addition, the administrators also assume responsibilities to make sure that they are preparing teachers to be fully comfortable and able to lead these lessons as part of instruction. So for example, when you think about, just like you teach expectations as part of your PBIS structure where you're teaching those setting expectations, we would want to budget instructional time to teach these social skills to kids school-wide. And then it's not just teaching the lessons and crossing it off their list. Teachers are continually referring back to that to support kids in gaining these skills and applying them as they're working in small groups and working with others and managing their own issues. Also, as part of this plan, there is a systematic look to see how kids are doing at multiple time points in terms of responding to these Tier 1 efforts, because a clear goal is to make sure that we are detecting kids that need more than Tier 1 has to offer. So when we think about that idea of systematic screening, we don't want to just jump in with screening. We want to make sure that as we are installing this Tier 1 effort to prevent challenges from happening for kids socially and emotionally, they also want to make sure that teachers are feeling comfortable with the goals and the procedures and the outcomes. So at these schools, twice a year in fall and spring, teachers are giving feedback on their level of comfort with all of Tier 1. And they're also sharing out what their level of fidelity is. Like, are they teaching the lessons? Are they revisiting those concepts, etc.? An important part of that, as Mark mentioned, is this idea of systematic screening, where you're systematically looking 3 times a year. Ideally, it's fall, winter, and spring. And I know we've had other webinars where we've talked about what systematic screening looks like, but in brief, you wait 4 to 6 weeks after the school year begins to conduct that first screening time point. A big difference between behavior screenings in schools compared to academic screening is that it's not requiring any time with the student. So it's not like I'm approaching a student and saying, are you internalizing? They are teacher-completed measures. They are independent. And as Mark also mentioned, it is very important to make sure that there are systems and structures set up to protect the confidentiality of these scores. So when teachers complete them and save them, you want to have careful considerations as to how they're completed. They are then, again, screened in winter, prior to winter break. And it's important to screen prior to winter break rather than after it, because in many secondary schools and middle and high schools, kids will be changing classrooms when they come back, and we need to make sure that teachers have sufficient time to know the students before completing those screeners. They do a third point in spring prior to the end of the year, and in each of those you're looking to see like the overall level of risk in a building. You're looking to see which teachers might have a higher percentage of kids in a class, a point that we're going to talk about in just a couple minutes. But in each of these instances, when you're picking a screener, you want to attend to issues of reliability and validity, but you also want to look to points Mark was talking about issues of feasibility. We don't want to get into a situation where we begin screening and then economically or resource-wise, we can't afford to keep that moving in the future. Now, there are a number of different screening tools. For example, there's the systematic screening for behavior disorders, which has recently had its second edition come out, and this now goes from preschool through the early high school years, and it is a multiple gating system that Mark mentioned, so that you start off by considering all students, and this is not just general education community, it's all kids that are attending a school, even those on an IEP, would get screened. These data are from one specific school, and it's showing their winter time point over time. So if you look on the left-hand side at the blue bars, you're looking at the percentage of kids who are screening in as having externalizing behaviors. And on the right side, on the green, you're looking at the percentage of kids having internalizing issues. And while this is not a randomized control trial, you can see that as you look at like the left-hand side, there were 60 kids that passed through that first grade. There were 13 kids at that first time point when they screened in 2007 that had kids that exceeded normative criteria for acting out. That represented 6% of the entire school. And then the next winter, you see that it's only 7 kids screening in. Now remember, new kindergarten kids in, 5th graders going on to middle school, but that percentage is now down to 3.5. And in a school, you're looking to get to between 3 to 5% of kids at risk, at that high level of risk. And then on the internalizing side, you see that same pattern of declining. Now the benefits of screening are many, but one of them is this idea of increased transparency. So when I'm thinking about who might need assistance from the mental health teams in districts, if you can use screening to help drive that decision making, you are limiting the likelihood of missing kids that might need support. So as Mark mentioned, we want to be very cognizant of sometimes we'll have false positives where we're screening kids in when they don't actually need the support, and we also have false negatives when we're overlooking a kid who does. But in the area of prevention, missing a kid who needs the extra support is the larger concern. In terms of free access tool, Drummond, also from University of Oregon, established the student risk screening scale, which was originally developed to look for kids with acting out behaviors. And as you look at these items, I want to make a really clear point that we are not saying a kid is a liar, is a cheater, is a stealer. What you're looking for is to see, do these behaviors occur together and to a high enough degree? Because if they do, they predict very important outcomes for kids. So these individually completed screenings that I'm talking about right now are teacher completing screenings. And some of them, there are other screening tools available that can be parent completed and can be student completed. But in these cases, we are having teachers independently rate each student, and each student winds up with a score that places them into a low, moderate, or high-risk category. So it looks very much like this. This is a free access tool that is very easy to use. It's often selected by schools, I think, in part because it is precise, but also because it is very feasible, so it is easy to sustain over time. So when you look at these data, the one that I'm showing you now, these are data from a middle school, and I want to show you these dates in these graphs. If you look, these are from like 2004, 2007, because I want to make the point that screening is not new. It is something that is well established and is actually not terribly difficult to install in schools, and the key is to make sure that you're ready to use the screening data that you do collect. So here's data from a middle school, and those green bars represent the percentage of kids in that school that are screening into the low-risk category. And then the yellow bars represent the percentage of kids screening into the moderate risk category, and red is the high-risk category. So again, not a randomized control trial, but if you look over time as they are installing their CI3T model where they're teaching those social and emotional curriculum at Tier 1, you have a strong PBIS framework, and you're giving careful consideration to roles and responsibilities for academics, we are moving forward and putting a larger percentage of kids in that low-risk category. And this is important because we know that those data actually predict how well kids do over the course of not just a single academic year, but multiple years. So a kid's screening score actually predicts how many office discipline referrals they'll learn, how many days they're spending in on-campus suspension. It predicts their grade point average and their course failures. And that's true for middle and high school, and it also predicts very important outcomes at the elementary level as well. And in recent years, a growing concern has been expressed about the idea of looking for kids with internalizing issue. And the work of Kent McIntosh has taught us very clearly that if we do not systematically look for kids with internalizing issues, we will overlook them. Because in traditional PBIS models, you can use office discipline referral data to drive who might have Tier 2 and who might have Tier 3. But if we don't systematically look for kids that have internalizing issues, we will miss these students. So recently, the SRSS IE has been adapted for use at the elementary level and middle schools and high school levels to actually systematically also look for kids with internalizing concerns. So there are now new items with preliminary cut scores being available currently for elementary, and the middle school and high school cut scores are currently under review, and we'll keep people posted as to that as that time comes. And in looking at these different screening tools, you can use these data to connect kids. So as you look at this next slide that Jessica's pulling back up for us, thank you, you will be able to see that these are hypothetical data. Yes.
We have a good question in the chat pod about the margin of error for our screeners. We know that screeners typically have a larger margin of error because they're screeners and they're not diagnostic tools. But can you speak to the confidence, the margin of error for the SRSS? Wait, hold on, SRSS. There we go.
There you go. Lots of S's and yes, and that's something we'll be talking about in just one moment. Because you're right, and in a screening, you're going to want to pick a tool that has a higher percentage of false positive than false negative, and it depends on the population that you're looking at. But each of those cut scores are carefully constructed to make sure that you're limiting the number of false positive versus false negatives. But some screening tools, you're right, do have a higher margin for error for both. But in just a moment, we're going to talk about how you can use diagnostics to actually help drive that decision making. But at the most global level, like looking at these hypothetical data, teachers can get 2 different scores on every single student in their class, and then you can look to see how they're doing on the acting out and on the internalizing dimension. So when you think about screening, sometimes people are very overwhelmed at the beginning of what are we going to do when we find kids that are having these challenges, and my encouragement to you is to first begin to use these data to look at Tier 1 as a whole. So for example, here's data from an actual elementary school that screened for the first time in fall of 2014. This represents the percentage of kids in their overall building that were at low risk, and then you can see as they progress over time with their installation of these Tier 1 practices, we start to see improvement for kids. We also can look to see if there are specific grade levels that are having challenges so that you know, again, how to focus your intervention efforts. So you can break it down by each specific grade level. We can do the same thing for internalizing issues, because if you look at that school on the left hand, like the first time point, we can see that there's a large percentage of students at the beginning of this journey for them that had internalizing issues. So their first response was to address this at Tier 1. And that was part of the value of selecting and installing and teaching kids those social and emotional skills that they needed to be successful, not just in the school setting, but beyond as well as they interacted with their peers. And same with the internalizing dimension, we can look to see how kids are doing across the grade spans in a school. The same is true for high schools. These are data from a high school that also started screening for the first time. And again, you can look at these breakdowns to see where most of the challenges are. And also, you can explore issues of predictive validity. So when you use these screening data, I want to quickly make the point that although we're talking about supporting students with individual needs, we have also the responsibility to look at our entire system to make sure that we are addressing kids' needs at Tier 1 in an effort to prevent challenges from occurring. So for example, if I have a school like this where I'm still seeing improvement, I'm still not quite where I want to be in terms of getting 80% of my kids' needs being met in Tier 1. So I'd want to focus on further enhancing not only the installation of Tier 1, but making sure that I'm empowering teachers to know how to use low-intensity strategies in the classroom as well. So when I look at this middle school, though, I see that Tier 1 efforts are working pretty well. We've got a small percentage of kids that are not responding, and I would be prepared to quickly connect kids to Tier and 2 3 supports, again, making it very transparent as to who needs more. But as Jessica just mentioned, and as comments are coming up in the chat, these are just screeners, so they do not tell you exactly where the challenges occur. So one of the things that we also encourage people to do and empower teachers, so the general ed and special education communities, to be well-equipped with low-intensity strategies that will allow them to have a data-informed approach for knowing when to use what strategies to support engagement, minimize disruption, and increase participation in class. So for example, when teachers are able to, now they can look at multiple sources of data. They can look to see how students are performing in reading and in math and on their behavioral performance and absenteeism, and then they can use that information to shape instruction. So for example, a story comes to mind where a teacher was struggling with very low levels of participation in this really advanced class. When she looked at the screening data, she realized for her class there was a large percentage of kids that were scoring in the moderate risk range for internalizing issues. She used that information to shape her instruction. So rather than asking kids to participate in large class discussions, she began shifting it to talk to the person next to you, work in a small group. So in addition to instructional adjustments, we can also empower teachers with these types of low-intensity strategies, such as building an instructional choice or increasing kids' opportunities to respond, that again support kids being positively and productively engaged in class, minimizing disruptions and helping kids also to be able to interact successfully with their peers and with their adults. But realizing that even when teachers are implementing these strategies, and if you want to learn more about these, you can go to a number of places, but if you want, you can log into ci3t.org, and there you can download little modules to see exactly how to teach teachers to use these strategies in their classrooms. But if these are all in place, so if we've got solid Tier 1 implementation, and teachers are using these low-intensity strategies with fidelity, we can still be assured that there will be additional students that are still going to have Tier 2 and Tier 3 needs. We just want to be really careful not to say that a student needs additional support if we don't know if they're fully accessing Tier 1 supports to start with, which is why we need to make sure, like when we're looking at these types of screening data, we want to make sure Tier 1 is installed with fidelity. We've got a strong pattern of responding so that we can be resource efficient to be able to connect kids to these extra supports. Now, one of the ways that many schools in this model have been meeting kids' multiple needs is to design Tier 2 and Tier 3 grids that clearly define what is available to people that need more than Tier 1 has to offer. So, for example, I can do, as a first line of defense, I might do things that are evidence-based practices like behavior contracts or self-monitoring with any of those targets. It could be I could have as a goal for students to initiate more social interactions or to complete more work or to improve it could improve work completion or oral reading fluency. But in each of these, we want to describe what that support is so that people know who's doing what to whom and under what conditions. And now, rather than it being arbitrary as to who gets these extra supports, instead, I want to use screening data to connect these students to support. And so I would be explicit in saying this support might be of use for a student who has, and then specify the entry criteria. And then whatever we're doing at Tier 1, we want to make sure that that's monitored with fidelity, and the same is true for Tier 2. So for example, we want to, when we put two students into these extra supports, we want to have data to make sure that they're accessing it, which is the treatment integrity. We want to make sure that kids are comfortable with it before they start, because like if a student is telling you, oh my gosh, it would make me even more anxious if I had to have a self-monitoring form on my desk to look at my engagement or participation, then we would do something else. And we would have a progress monitoring measure to see how that extra support is working for students. And then, so it doesn't become like the Hotel California where kids are checking into these interventions and never leaving, we want to have a plan for when it's time to leave those supports. And when we think specifically about the idea of supporting kids that have mental health needs within the school system, it is the same logic when building these grids. So on this slide, which will be available to you later, there are a whole series of these different types of Tier 2 counselor-led sessions that are intended to support kids that do need more than Tier 1 has to offer. And these lessons, and these are just one form, but these are available as part of like the positive action lessons unit. So if the screening data suggests that kids need more than Tier 1 have to offer, counselors can do more intensive interventions, teaching kids these skills such as getting along with others or being able to manage themselves or using calming strategies, etc., to support kids in feeling more positive, safe, and productive in school and getting their needs met. When you talk about the idea of learning how to focus these efforts, when we look at things like social skills groups, one of the things we need to be aware of is where exactly do we need to focus these efforts. And the good news is that when kids do screen in as needing extra support, and if these lower intensity strategies such as behavior contracts or self-monitoring or more general calming strategies or cognitive restructuring, those types of things are not sufficient, I can then also use diagnostics such as the Social Skills Improvement System rating scale to be able to detect where kids' strengths are in their social skills and also where their additional areas of concerns are so that I can use data to drive the content of the group. So you might imagine for a second kids screening in as moderate or high risk who may have also had office discipline referrals that suggest challenges in getting along with peers, or it could be issues of concerns about, anxiety or safety in coming to school. I can get parent permission to do these more focused assessments, and from that I can learn where kids' challenges are. So if I am in a small group with Jessica, Ivan, and Mark, it might be my specific challenge are issues related to internalizing issues. I might have trouble making my needs known. I might have trouble reaching out to a group, whereas Mark might have strengths in those areas. So in these small groups, even though we're all there with certain goals of things that we want to work on, he could be my peer model for one skill that I'm more competent in, and then I can be his peer model for skills that I am more confident in. So each of these grids basically represents a collection of the available support for kids that need more than Tier 1 has to offer. So just prior to the start of this call, Jessica and I were talking about this idea of mentoring. I can do the same thing to support kids that might have additional needs across the grade span in terms of mentoring. But the reason for having this clarity in terms of what is available for everyone at Tier 1, what's available for some kids at Tier 2, and then the most intensive supports reserved for kids at Tier 3 is that we want to make sure that it is completely transparent, because part of closing these gaps in achievement are closing these gaps in access. And when we think about supporting kids' social and emotional well-being, it is the same logic as with academics. And as Mark mentioned at the very beginning, we don't want to shy away from the idea that school is a wonderful place to support kids' multiple needs. Ideally, as we're thinking about intervening at Tier 2 or Tier 3 and doing really intensive interventions, it is an important point to remember that in this coordinated approach to meeting kids' academic behavior and social needs, you can look at all the data at the same time to get a better picture of what the student needs. And sometimes it's not a within-child need, it's more of a system need. So for example, as I close, I just want to make the point that, in some situations, people are working like crazy to put kids into these Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. And I've had people say, oh my gosh, Kathleen, you're going to be so impressed. We've got 42% of the kids in Tier 2, and I just want to say sit down for a second because you're working too hard. If you have that many kids needing Tier 2 needs, that means we need to first shore up on Tier 1. So as you move forward and shifting this back to Mark, he's going to give you another illustration, but I just want to encourage you to think about being transparent, making the available resources that are available at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 really clear, but also equally accessed through the use of screening data. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Mark.
Sure. Thank you, Kathleen. Really excellent. So Kathleen's example highlighted a school system taking on this agenda. And so really, in an ideal world, the school system is reaching out and building partnerships with the mental health system and other youth-serving systems like the child welfare and juvenile justice system. But also, those systems are reaching in and trying to build partnerships with the schools. So this is an example of the latter. John Crocker and colleagues in Methuen, Massachusetts, who are part of the National Quality Initiative that I mentioned earlier, reaching into the schools from the mental health system, having their finger on the pulse of critical public health needs for youth in the community, and then reaching into the schools to try to identify youth in need and do screening. So you can just see some of the highlights from this process where they're focusing in on the community saying we have lots of students who are depressed and anxious and therefore likely not to finish high school and have other problems in their lives. So let's get a sense for what's going on. So using public domain measures for anxiety and depression, doing these screenings in a large high school, having an opt-out process so that parents are notified about the upcoming screening and then are able to not have their child participate. And then really this point really showing strong follow-up, really being committed that when students present needs, being committed to actually provide follow-up care to them. This provides some more specific data on the process. John points out that we had only about 45% participate, but this was not related to a lot of families opting out, but rather the school advisors not really presenting the opportunity for students to participate. So that's part of the agenda, is making sure schools are on board with the work involved in actually doing screening. But you can see here percentages that are consistent with what I presented earlier, around 10% of students in the severe range, around 12% in the moderate range, so more than 20%, and that's true for both of these measures, more than 20% of students presenting needs for more intensive services. Again, so I think we need to revisit this notion of only about 5% of students in the quote-unquote red zone needing care. In some cases, it's going to be more like 20% of students. But anyway, that's just another example. John and Kathleen and I and a colleague of Kathleen's will be presenting at the PBIS Implementers Forum organized by Lucille Eber, Cheryl Kennerly, and colleagues October 27th and 8th in Chicago. So it'll be an opportunity for those of you who attend that meeting to go into a little bit more detail on this topic of mental health screening. I'll turn it back over to Kathleen related to some recommendations, and then we can perhaps have an interaction with you all with Jessica's assistance on questions or comments that you might have. So back to Kathleen.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. And as we close out with this content before opening it up, I'm seeing wonderful questions coming through on the chat about concerns about, like, what if we screen in more kids that we're not prepared to support, or, you know, are there other curricula? There are lots of different curricula available. I only highlighted 2, and I don't want you to take those as endorsements. It's very important that people pick, you know, their own primary prevention agendas. But when you screen, we want to make sure that we screen responsibly. And these are a few recommendations for you to consider. Number 1 is to make sure to build your stakeholders' expertise. So prior to conducting a screening, we don't want to just get excited about screening and then go back and do it. We want to think very thoughtfully about organizing and making transparent what your plans are for supporting kids and meeting all their needs, academic, behavior, and social and emotional. So we want to think about what can we teach at Tier 1 that we can empower our teachers to be ready to roll out with confidence. And then when they are doing the screening, we want to make sure that they know the first thing is not just to think that every kid needs a Tier 2 or a Tier 3. We want to look at this from a systemic perspective. So we want to see, like, what percentage of kids in my building are struggling in these areas. Because if you look and you have, you know, only 40% of your kids scoring in the average range for internalizing issues, then I know that's a Tier 1 consideration. So your response to the screening data is to really focus on Tier 1 implementation. And then the second recommendation is to think about the structures to sustain and improve practices. So when you think about what you're doing at Tier 1 and what you currently have available at Tier 2 and at Tier 3, we want to start asking ourselves some challenging questions of, do we have data to suggest that what we are doing, if done with fidelity, is actually yielding the return? And you may find that there are some practices taking place at Tier 2, like there might be some small groups or other practices that have no evidence to suggest that they work. And if that is the situation, then we want to be more intentional about using the data to connect kids with evidence-based practices or promising practices. So for example, in some of the systems that we work with, some of those Tier 2 supports are things that are evidence-based practices. So it is actually teaching kids skills that are not in their skill sets and supporting them and using them elsewhere. Or it's building things like, cognitive restructuring at Tier 2 as a strategy, or CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, at Tier 3. But we want to, rather than just grabbing something off a shelf to support a student, we want to make sure that there's evidence behind it to suggest that it works. And then that means we need to be prepared at the systems level to support people in getting confident and competent in doing those supports. And when we think about screening, we absolutely want to screen in a responsible fashion. And we really need to remember the fact that these data are important. Mark mentioned about the possibility of like opt-out. I can tell you that in the systems that we've supported, and there's schools in Arizona and California and Tennessee and Missouri and Vermont and others implementing CI3T models of prevention, and many in Kansas, that when they are going through that decision-making process, I urge you to remember that a parent is a member of this team. And those conversations about screening, they're not a secret. Screening data are absolutely something that should be made well aware of. So we encourage people when they send home like informational letters at the beginning of the year to let parents know that that's happening. Like then that you let them know we are continuing with vision screening and hearing screening, and we will be benchmarking 3 times a year for academics and behavior and social considerations to make sure that we're best serving your child. And yes, they should have an opportunity to opt out, but it's also important for students or parents to know what they would be opting out of. You would be missing an opportunity to see if a student needs more than Tier 1. We would be missing an opportunity to give people the information they know to shift instruction to support their students in being successful. And absolutely, we want to know our state and local laws for screening. And some states have very different laws for screening. When we think about teacher-completed screenings, one thing I encourage people to think about is that when they are teacher-completed, if a teacher had a concern about somebody being hurtful to others or hurtful to themselves, those concerns would have already been reported because they are a mandated reporter. But if you are going to introduce other screenings than those we've talked about today, like student-completed screenings or parent-completed screenings, you are introducing new information. And that would likely require a different level of parent consent. And usually that would be active consent, meaning that they actually have to sign for it. So as you think about screening, I encourage you to keep those ideas in mind. And I encourage you to visit PBIS.org, which is one of the leading places to go to get wonderful information, not just about screening, but about what to do at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And they're currently working on some wonderfully exciting revisions on that website. And I also encourage you, if you would, to check out ci3t.org, where there's an entire tab related to screening. There are YouTube videos, there are coaching protocols to help people get prepared to screen, etc. So as we wrap up today and open the last 10 minutes up for questions, I just want you to know that as we are all highly committed to making sure that we're supporting kids and becoming really confident and capable and productive citizens, we want to make sure that we are fully attending to all their needs and not shying away from that social and emotional domain.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have a few questions in the chat pod, starting with Dr. Eber here. She said that, a lot of mental health programs screen for specific conditions, and traditionally PBIS we've screened at Tier 1. And so she's looking for some information to share on how to blend into a multi-tiered screening system that moves into more specific processes or tools as you get through the gate to like Tier 2 and Tier 3.
Great. Mark, do you want to take that one? Would you like me to?
Go ahead, Kathleen.
So when you're looking at screening at Tier 1, those screenings that we had on that one slide, like the systematic screening for behavior disorders, the student risk screening scale, the BAS2, BAS, et cetera, those are all Tier 1 type screenings. And then when kids screening into those, we can use very general procedures to start thinking about some low intensity supports. But you're right, you're going to want to get additional information on where the nature of those challenges lie. So for those, you're going to want to get parent permission to look more deeply at where the challenges occur. So for example, you would want to get parent permission to see where those challenges are by completing like the social skills improvement system. But any screening tool that you're going to do that is not truly for every student would require parent permission. So there are tools available that will likely be the place where you would ask parents or students to complete those types of screenings. So you can think of that, again, back to that gating idea. Another question that we see there is, like, is there a site to find evidence-based Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 strategies? And yes, you can go to places like What Works Clearinghouse. You can put in, like on that site and others like SAMHSA, you can indicate I'm looking for like a social or emotional or behavioral or academic or reading support. You can specify the grade levels that you're looking to support, and that will actually click you through what has currently been synthesized. And there's also the National Intensive Intervention Center has sites, and then there's RTI for Success. So there's a number of places that have already vetted the research and compiled it, so that because we keep telling people use data, but we sure don't make it very easy for them to find those resources. So there are a number of warehouses that you can go to look for that.
Yeah, and if I could comment, there's also SAMHSA's NREP, National Registry of Effective Practices and Programs. But it's not all manualized programs, and within the child and adolescent mental health field, there's also this movement toward modular strategies. So, for example, when youth are presenting with depression, anxiety, conduct problems, trauma-related problems, what are the top things you should be focused on in intervention with them? And it's commonly cognitive behavioral therapy. So, for example, for anxiety, your intervention should focus on cognitive coping strategies, relaxation, but also often on exposure. So there's a movement toward not just, for every tier we need, 1 or 2 manualized interventions. As you move to Tier 2 and Tier 3, modular strategies, really emphasizing cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, can be used as well. And there's a website called practicewise.org that provides background on the modular strategy.
And as Mark's talking about those modular strategies, like if you have time to go back and look at some of these slides, the one that we had where we had several counselor-led Tier 2 supports coming in, one of those, they globally call that calming strategies, but that's exactly the type of stuff that they would teach the students that had those ongoing concerns with those strategies. So not everything at Tier 2 is a package or a program. A lot of it is strategy-based, and that's important to note because a lot of people have the misconception that all of Tier 2 is a come to the table and work through this curriculum with me, and that's not the case, as Mark mentioned.
Yeah, and Dennis Embry and Tony Biglin, their work on kernels, so parts of evidence-based practices that can be implemented by themselves is also another avenue to consider.
Some schools that we work with also, they will actually teach some of those calming strategies or other like CBT strategies at Tier 1 for all their students, especially when they're like schools that are working in really high poverty neighborhoods or places where you've had a lot of trauma issues. So we would want to make sure that we're empowering that entire student body to have those supports.
These are great questions in the chat pod, and thanks to everybody for a lot of folks are posting some resources as they come up, and not just me, which is nice. Are there any? We have 1 minute left. I want to say thank you and see if we have any outstanding questions. And also let folks know that you are welcome to, you can email me. I'll put this is Jessica Swain Bradway. I'll put my email address in the chat pod here. If other questions come up or you have questions in general about the School Climate Transformation Grant webinar series, we certainly appreciate your time and your energy. Thank you, Kathleen and Mark. I always learn something when I listen to both of you speak. And we want to say thanks again to everybody. We're going to wrap up. We're going to end our recording here, and I will hang out in the chat pod for a little bit longer if folks have additional questions or comments.